Bavarians, they began by the 8th century, they had a 10-month calendar, and then they added a couple of months. Then, again, an arbitrary question, when do you have New Year? Well, New Year you might have in March. Why might you have it in March? If you were a Roman or anybody else. Beginning of spring, that's right. Why have it in that dark, deadly time of winter? Why not celebrate the fact that days are getting longer, it's getting warmer, so have it in spring? So in fact, a lot of people have said, and we'll see it recurs, it doesn't just shift for once. Some want to have it in spring, some want to have it, so all these arbitrary things. So you had to keep messing around with the calendar. Now, Julius Caesar came along and gave us the Julian calendar in his reign. But again, he had 365 days, and he didn't have it quite right. So fairly quickly, things started to go out of whack. They actually had to chop a whole chunk out of the calendar because it had got so out of whack by that reign. And still, they didn't have it quite right, so along comes Augustus, and he makes a further course correction to get it right. And so we end up not with the Julian calendar, but the Augustan calendar. And that's now more or less because of the extent of the Roman Empire. That's more or less the calendar we live with for 1,000 years or more, even into long into the Christian era. So those two guys named the calendar. The Romans add 2 months to the calendar. Anybody notice anything about those two coincidental facts? Adam, you're my man. Yeah. That's where we get July and August from. And in fact, in chucking July and August into the middle of the calendar, it made the calendar seem rather odd to us now, if you stop and think about the names of months. Any thoughts why? Yes, sorry, you were? Jesse, yeah. Because when you start with like September, October, November, December, 7, 8, 9. Right, the numbering goes all to whack, because what was the 7th month becomes the 9th month, but you leave its name as September, as Jesse says, the 7th month. And so December, which for us is the 12th month, and yet oddly has the Roman word for 10 built into it. So all these kind of things get tricky and messed around, but we live with them and we don't notice, and time runs on. We have that tricky question again of when to begin, and in fact it's around the 5th century that Dionysius Exiguus comes along, so we're now more or less in the Christian calendar, decides we need to think of where it all began. So he says, let's say we can calculate, and he tried to calculate when the birth of Christ happened, and said we'll call that the year 0, anything before that we count backwards, anything since. So that seemed nice and clear, but again, in the way of these things, you have to get everybody to accept it, you have to get everybody to agree on it. They don't always agree, so this is actually a document from the 12th century, which I like, because it's somebody who wants to make sure that everybody knows when this inquest was made. But he's not quite sure anyone will accept just a single year. So he says the 1118th year AD, so since the year of Christ, the 21st year of Pope Alexander III, so we can date from that time, the 27th regnal year of King Henry II. Anyone heard of the phrase regnal year before? They're still used in England. Laws are still dated by regnal years for many centuries. It's how long since the reign of that particular king. And in fact, this guy's so uncertain about people will accept his date that he gives another regnal year. Then he also gives the year in which the bishop came. And he thinks by the time you've got all of that, you can't disagree with me. But he feels he has to do all that work to establish what the date is. So feel lucky when you can say 2012. In the church, time, again, starts to be equated with money. We met one of these things before. What was this? Do you remember from the printing press? An indulgence, thank you. So it was an indulgence, and the church made a nice amount of money selling them, and Pope Clement came up with a quick price schedule, so you could see how much you had to pay to get time off for good behavior. But even as time rolled on, the fact that that quarter day was missing from the calendar started to push the calendar out again. And they made adjustments to the new year. They said, so we had the new year in March. So having gone back to January for the new year, they pushed it back to March again, and now they said it was a religious feast of the Ascension that they would have it. They had a huge struggle for Easter. Now most of us know the concept of Easter. How is Easter dated? How do we know when Easter Sunday falls? Now that'd be nice. If we could give it just as a simple date, life would be easier. Unfortunately, they weren't quite as cooperative as that. Does anybody actually know? Oh, you'll all put your Easter bonnets on, you'll all eat your Easter eggs, but you have no idea when anything. It's the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. Of course, obvious, isn't it? And now, not only is that a kind of weird calculation, it brings two calendars together. It brings the lunar calendar and the solar calendar together. And it actually means that if you're trying to write that date for multiple years ahead, you have to be fairly precise about when those things will fall. But if you've got the number of days in the calendar slightly wrong, they're not going to fall when you predict. So people would write calendars of multiple years, and Easter would turn up on the wrong side of the spring equinox. And people would hang on, no, it's got to be after the spring equinox. So they had, again, all sorts of trouble because they got the calendar wrong. So once more, they found someone, Luigi Lelio, and in fact, he's always the credit is given to Gregory, though he was actually first appointed under, I think, Pius XII, I think it was. And he decided that, look, we've got to introduce leap years. That'll sort out a lot of this balance, and we'll be able to write calendars over the long term. But we'll also have a centurial year, because in fact, it isn't exactly a quarter day that the calendar does. Does anyone know what a centurial year is? Leap years, how do leap years fall? Sorry? Mumble? What was that mumble? Every 4 years. Is it always every 4 years? When are they not? An even year divisible by 100, so that's the centurial year. So we put in this extra little tick just to allow for the variance that isn't exactly 365 and a quarter. And because the calendar had got so out of whack, they said, look, you may think that tomorrow is going to be October the 6th, but actually we're going to take a big chunk out of the calendar. And today will be October the 4th, and tomorrow will be October the 15th, and those days in the middle will just be missing. So the Pope understands this, sends out a bull, as they were called, tells everybody to obey this, and then the calendar will now be back in sync, so everybody will have the right calendar and will be in sync with the sun, the moon, and all the religious feast days. Anyone envisage any problems to that? And we've already seen the Americans and the Brits fighting over a leap second. We've seen Samoa dodging back and forth back across the border. So anyone predict that if a Pope sits up and says, do this, there might be a hesitation? Who would hesitate? Well, that's why they would, and it's important. And so that's, in fact, you see that people say, look, if you cut out those days, the landlord's going to come in and demand his money early. The king's going to come in and demand money from the widow and the parson. All these people and the domestic servants, damn it, they're going to ask for their pay early. So there was a lot of popular superstition that this was absolutely reprehensible. There was even some superstition that, look, if my name is written down in the book of life, and you chop 11 days out of the calendar, I'm going to live 11 days shorter than I originally predicted. If the book of life says I'm going to die on, and you can tell, so what about my 11 days? But in fact, also, there was a great and very strong reaction from those who didn't get on so well with the Pope. So the English Protestants, the British Protestants, the Northern European Protestants didn't. The Orthodox Church, indeed, didn't. And so part of Europe said, we're not going to go along with it. That's some kind of popish conspiracy. As John Wallis, early member of the Royal Society, very sophisticated mathematician, one of the early writers about encryption and code, and was known for his ability to break codes. But he said, we don't have to go along with this. It was interesting because Newton was on the other side, and Newton, in fact, was there in part because his great enemy, Leibniz, was writing to the Royal Society saying, look, you've got to go along with this, we have to conform. But in fact, the British didn't, and the English didn't, and they didn't, and the Americans either for a long time. It wasn't, in fact, until 1752 where things had got so absurd that they decided that they should finally bring the calendar into sync. Now, not only with the church, but clearly they realized that they had trouble with the sun and the moon and all those other things that they were trying to predict. There are lots of wonderful stories about street protests of people saying, give us back our 11 days, you've stolen them from my life. Most of them are taken from this wonderful Hogarth painting where, you can't quite see it, I think written on this chalkboard is the protest, give us our 11 days. That, in fact, though, oddly, in a way that we think of time as this scientific matter, has a lot of residual effects. Those of us, and there aren't many of you in this room, I imagine, who have to pay their tax in the UK, actually have to, the tax year ends, not as the American was, does nicely on the 31st of December, but on the 6th of April. Anyone want to say why it's the 6th of April? Well, the old rental system, the one that in fact there were complaints about, usually you paid your rents and most of your bills on what were called the quarter days. You paid them on the 25th of March, on Michaelmas, you paid them midsummer, you paid them on Lady Day, then Michaelmas in the fall, and then you paid them on December 25th. And in fact, if you get to 26 and then chop 12 days out of the calendar, you come out at the beginning of April. So its tax system is still based on the old calendar in an odd way. And in fact, if you look back, and we will have this problem when we start to talk about intellectual property, is that while they went along not only with the old calendar, the Augustan calendar, but they also kept New Year in March. And so the question is, if you have the date of March the 1st, if you live on continental Europe, you can say that's March the 1st of 1710. But if you live in England, you have exactly the same date, March the 1st, but it's still called 1709 because New Year hasn't come along. Because in fact, March, not December, was the last of the year. And so people have trouble dating things. Again, it's these old people, no problem for us. Except if we look at some of the most significant and sophisticated resources of information today, like Wikipedia, and we read the article on the history of copyright, we discover that the Statute of Anne happened in 1709. Whereas if we look at the Statute of Anne in Wikipedia, we discover it happened on 1710. Because they can't agree about what their dates are inside, because one of them is in fact trying to give the old date and one of them is trying to give the new date, but nobody's thought to talk to each other across those two. In fact, it's interesting, it happens a lot with Wikipedia. You can get nice articles which seem internally coherent, but they disagree entirely with articles elsewhere on the same topic, because no one has the role of bringing those things together. And in fact, we should know when we do intellectual property that in fact, in general, the Statute of Anne is regarded as being happening in 1710. You will occasionally find people writing dates like that, and that usually means it's a date that occurs in the first 3 months of the year, where in England it was still 1709, whereas in continental Europe it was 1710. And the Russians, in fact, carried on well into the 19th century. We get other attempts. The French Revolution, they decide, look, the calendar's a real mess. Let's start all over again. Not only let's start with the year 1, and therefore get rid of all that religious superstition, but let's go really nicely and have a decimal system. We'll have 10 days a week, 10 months to a year. Still a problem in some ways. We'll have the new year begin in September. All those people fighting over whether it should be December or in March. And then we will have the months with a whole set of new names. Anyone know want to guess what any of those names mean? Vendemer, that's actually September. It's the harvest, it's the vendima. Brumaire, it gets foggy. Frimaire, it gets frosty. Nivose, it gets snowy. Pluvose, it gets rainy. Ventos, it gets windy, and so on. So you now call the calendar by what it's like out there. It gets hot at Thermidor. We get the meadows in Prairial, the flowers, the seeds. So we have this nice sort of thing that Thomson was talking about, the rhythm of the seasons they built back into the calendar. This happens in the 1790s. Is there anything about that seems odd with regard to what Thomson was talking about? Well, what did he see as the driving influence in changing our sense of time? Labor force? What was the more general term if you think of the title of that essay? What did he see as sorry? Capitalism, industrial capitalism. So he saw our lives being changed by capitalism, and yet here in France we still have this sort of agricultural rhythm being built into the new calendar. Didn't in fact last for very long, it changed under the Empire. Okay, so I'm falling well behind in time, but that's all right. So the technology of time, we had to know a little bit about that. The efforts to find out the time, and particularly things like the equinox, are enormous. And you see lots and lots of different traces of people trying to work out when time was. Why is it actually significant? Getting back to that French calendar. Why is it significant, actually? Why do you care? Why do you say, look, tomorrow, it's that time of year when the days will be longer, get the time of year, Sundays will be shorter, that's probably going to be cold, we can live with that. Why do we need more precision than that? Yeah. It affects the harvest. In what way does it? Sorry, you... Elizabeth, so what way does it affect the harvest? You're not actually the right track, but a bit more. Think it through just a little more. Well, you have to make some pretty long-term investments as a farmer, in that you have to decide to take all those seeds and take them out and stick them in the ground, and that when you put them in the ground, it's not going to be too cold when they're seeds, and equally, they will have time over the summer to sprout before you harvest, before it turns too cold again or too wet to bring the harvest in. So you actually have to make some fairly good predictions about when spring is going to begin, and also when fall is going to end for your particular world. So in order to keep agricultural life moving along, and again, if you look both in Fisher and in that Keeping a Day book, they talk a lot about how important it is to be able to work out exactly when you will need labor, when you should plant, when you expect to harvest, when you need room for the harvest. Those were still, in 18th century America, your forebears, enormously important things, and for that you had to be able to predict what time of year it was. There is, in fact, in Fisher, there's a nice section called Dialing, when he tells people how they can try to tell both the time and the date. And you realize how difficult that was if you were somewhere way out in the Midwest and had neither reliable watches nor a calendar. And yet as a farmer you had to do it. So people look, for instance, at Stonehenges, and Jeff talked a little about Stonehenges and the earlier henges, the wood henges, and see these as ways, in fact, of trying to map the equinox or midsummer. In fact, as Atkinson says, most of what's been written about Stonehenge is nonsense. Most of them actually don't really know what it was. But they think it was some kind of clock system. More interesting in a way, as this was only discovered a few years ago, and Jeff mentioned this too, the Antikythera, an extraordinary elaborate brass mechanism of dials, the sort of thing people thought weren't made until late Middle Ages, but actually was found to be constructed by the Greeks, and again thought to be probably a timekeeping device. Clock time, Sundials, as Thomson said, these went on being used for a very long time, long after clocks came, but they've certainly been around for a long time. Water clocks became the next way, which is the steady drip of water leading on to different kinds of sand timer hourglasses. Sun Tzu influenced Europeans a lot by building a water tower which would move wheels and therefore could move the hands of clocks. And different ways of trying to calculate the time. This comes from Fisher's book, based in part on Joseph Moxon, who we've met before. You remember Moxon? He's the one who, from the Royal Society, who taught people the mechanic arts of printing. He was the one who wrote those books about mechanical devices, and he taught people how to do dialing, how to tell the time if you don't have a nice little computer in front of you telling you what it is. Carrying on, Richard of Wallingford, a strange medieval monk, built probably the first clock in a clock tower in England. Huygens, who we've met in the Royal Society, brought in the pendulum. Hooke, who we've also met as well, and gave us Hooke's law, and he was experimenting with springs in part because he wanted a watch that could be driven by a spring. And now we're starting to get standalone timepieces which will run on their own for a while, and at least in terms of the time of day, can be fairly reliable. Remember the piece about the Singe out on Arran, talking to that woman in a croft who says on sunny days, well, on windy days she can't tell the time, but on still days she can. Do you remember why she could tell the time so easily on? Yes, yes. Right, they wouldn't want to leave the door open when it was windy, and so they wouldn't have the shadow coming into the room, and therefore the shadow wouldn't tell them what time, and so meals would turn up at all sorts of erratic time. But on nice clear sunny days, you'd have the door open. So what you were looking for was some kind of device, what in fact Durham, using the word for the first time, calls an automata, the device which will run on its own and can be relied upon. So we start to get a series of systems now which are not entirely dependent on whether the sun is overhead. You can do it in the dark, you can start to tell what the time is. You don't have to have candles. You can carry them across distances and know how long you've been traveling. So the clock suddenly starts to be, and this is the period that Crosby and then Thomson are talking about, this device which gives people an orientation now towards time rather than towards nature. It goes global in many ways. Harrison, we've also mentioned, fought over the building of a nautical clock. Anyone know why his clock was so important? It's a long fight to build a clock that would be reliable at sea. And some people say, the supremacy of the British Navy in the 19th century was in part due to Harrison's work. In fact, there was a huge prize for him to produce a clock that was reliable at sea. Anyone know why? It was so you could measure longitude, that you actually needed to know what time of day it was when you took a sighting of the stars. But if you took most pendulum clocks out to sea, they would wander around, they would lose time, they would fall apart. So actually building a clock that could survive the rigors of sea was vital to navigation, but also very difficult to do. And in fact, you'll see that after Harrison's clock, the voyagers of people like Captain Cook, the great French and Dutch voyagers, in part become much more precise. They know where they are. It's remarkable in a way. Until then, people would discover islands and think they'd hit America and the like. But then you could really start to know longitude. We start to get this thing of telegraph time. And as you can send, when we get to the telegraph, as you start to send messages across long distances, you start to try to coordinate time between those two different points. Before that, the time it took to get a horse or even a train didn't really matter if they were necessarily on the same time. But once you get these almost instantaneous signals, that you start to say, well, now we better coordinate time. Because as I said, I think across England there was something like 12 different time zones, as many as Russia had until last year. And indeed, sometimes you just go from village to village and each would have their own time, because each would say, well, it's when the sun is right overhead here. I don't care what they say down the road. But as we started to move around, as the world became more global, people began to say, okay, and then the next question is, okay, well, what's not only the time but the date? And then there are moves to establish a date line so that everybody is living in the same year and the same time. So, in fact, the great marker, although the French fought it furiously, but the British in their imperial way said, okay, we're going to have the meridian. So at noon, the date line runs right through the Greenwich Observatory, that building in the middle there. And so all maps and charts will be measured to the west as you go one side of this line, and the east as you go to the other side of this line. And this is the line that divides the world. In their imperial way, they say, we will set that line in the ground. Now, in fact, you can go to the observatory and you see people queue up to straddle that line. Now, because this line runs the whole way around the world, you can straddle it wherever you choose, but somehow people feel they have to go to the observatory in order to do that. And in fact, if you're really gullible and you exit through the gift shop, you can even buy yourself a pair of socks that tell you whether you're on the east or the west of the line. So as you stand on either side, you can say that one's in the east and that one's in the west. But only when your sister insists on buying you socks that you have things like this. The US didn't standardize time until the 1880s. Any thoughts why? There's the world sort of standardizing in the 1850s. Right, sorry? Well, railways helped, and that was enormously important. But there were reasons why it was hard to standardize nonetheless. A lot of things didn't get sorted out until roughly this period. So the Transcontinental Railroad and Telegraph are in there, but that's not all. It's not, to give you a clue, it's not an east-west matter. The Civil War, and it wasn't, because you have two different economies. One which is becoming more and more industrial and reads more and more like E.P. Thompson, but one is still very, very much agricultural and doesn't really want to conform to what all these people up north are saying. So it was very hard to get a standardized time. People will tell you that it was, the telegraph or the railways did it, and both contributed enormously. But as I'm trying to suggest in the lecture, it takes a lot of other kinds of civil, social, and moral agreement. There is somebody straddling the line at Greenwich. Okay, so we have these ideas now of time getting finer and finer grained, and starting to talk about seconds and leap years and how many seconds short or more, 365 and a quarter days. But there are other big, big questions of time going on. Charles Lyell, a name anybody knows? Yes, Keith. Yes, Keith. Right, he starts to say, look, we have to think. He actually is a lawyer in part, and he goes up to Scotland, and he can't bear the law. His father forced him to do it. His hobby is geology. And he keeps looking at these rocks and the way they formed and they molded, and he starts to find fossils, and he says, look, the idea that the Earth is 4,000 years old just doesn't compute. These formations took much longer. And in fact, it's interesting, although, yes, he says, he fights against the church. In fact, for himself, it was a major fight. He had read Lamarck, the French